The reputed landing of an alien spaceship near Moscow recently has once again stirred up the public debate about UFOs. Although the reports about 10-foot-tall aliens have been dismissed as nonsense by most people, there are many who would argue that UFO landings can and have occurred, not only in the USSR, but in the US and other countries. Have UFOs been given a fair shake by science, journalism, and the government? George Knapp joins us now with part one of a cover story series, UFOs, the Best Evidence. George?
Well, Gary and Mary Ruth, some people might object to the use of the words UFOs and evidence in the same sentence. However, there is now a staggering amount of information on this subject, collected not by crackpots, but by respected, mainstream, level-headed people who want to know what, if anything, is going on. What we've tried to do is sift through as much of this information as possible to see if there's anything to it. In part one of UFOs, the Best Evidence, we explore whether the subject has been treated fairly by the establishment.
If you have a question, feel free to give us a call. Hi, you're next on the Billy Goodman thing on KVEG. The eggplant that ate Chicago, you remember that, huh?
And what was your encounter like, may I ask?
Billy Goodman's radio talk show is heard nightly in 10 western states, stretching from Canada to Mexico. Previously, the topic of choice was Elvis Presley's present whereabouts, but the focus drifted into UFOs, and Goodman's phone lines have been lit up ever since.
Oh, well, tell us about the last time when you were abducted, the very last time.
3 hours a night, 6 nights a week, the calls come in. Some callers claim to have been abducted by aliens. Other callers say they are aliens. This is pretty wild stuff.
Tell me about it. But this is what we get, and it goes on and on and on.
The popularity of Goodman's show is but one indication of the persistent public hunger for UFO lore. Despite discouragement by government, science, and religion, this is a story that will not go away. Is it the most pervasive and long-standing mass delusion in human history, or is something else at work here? Prominent sociologists have argued that even if there are no flying saucers or extraterrestrials, the stubborn durability of the UFO legend makes it worthy of study.
ET phone.
The human fascination with extraterrestrials is reflected in our most popular films and in popular TV programs. ET books are often perched atop bestseller lists. UFO updates grace the pages of mass circulation magazines. There are UFO hotlines and ET newsletters. Flying saucers have invaded the comic strips. UFO researchers like John Lear play to packed houses at library lectures. UFO organizations stage annual symposiums at which conventioneers can buy UFO tapes and UFO keychains, hats, and booklets, and more. I was abducted by aliens, and all I got was this lousy t-shirt. Flying saucers are big business, but the profiteering seems incidental to the enduring interest. Millions of people who have nothing to gain believe in UFOs. The most recent Gallup poll shows that nearly 60% of college-educated American adults believe that UFOs are extraterrestrial craft. The higher the education, the more likely the belief in UFOs.
We have a society today which accepts the basic notion of space travel, of visits by different kinds of beings to other places. That's a big step in just one generation.
But it's not merely a matter of blind faith. More than 20 million Americans say they've seen a UFO. 70,000 new sightings are reported each year. Even the most ardent UFO converts will concede that up to 90% of these sightings are mistakes, misidentifications of planets, or of conventional aircraft, or of military flares, or weather balloons, or other little-known natural phenomena. While it's true that 9 out of every 10 sightings is probably wrong, it's also true that only 1 in 10 sightings is ever reported at all. In general, these sightings are made by normal, well-balanced people who have nothing to gain and much to lose by stepping forward.
It was dark, there was 3 or 4 of us running along, and all of a sudden it was daylight, just brighter than all get out, and yet you could see over yonder that it was dark.
A tremendous streak just shot out of nowhere from the right and basically tailgated this plane. And it followed the plane for a very short period, and then it just stopped.
No noise, nothing. The same bright red color, and wasn't blinking or nothing. It was just like a ball of light.
What I saw were these balls of light traveling from the west to the east, all the way across the sky,
And there was lights all around it, the same color as the ship, and it was rotating. It was doing all kinds of maneuvers, zigzag movements, go fast this way and then that way, and then would flip over. And I saw this huge saucer-shaped vehicle. With, it was brightly lit, and it appeared to have dark areas, portholes of some sort.
Did you see that? You know, did you see that? You know, and everybody saw it, but nobody had an explanation.
I do know what I saw.
It wasn't a plane.
It wasn't a plane. It wasn't a helicopter.
It wasn't a weather balloon.
It wasn't a weather balloon. It wasn't a satellite.
It wasn't swamp gas.
It wasn't swamp gas. It wasn't any kind of light by itself. There was an actual object.
Many UFO sightings occur in broad daylight. Many involve multiple witnesses. The witnesses include pilots and policemen, even a president, people who are trained to be observant and whose judgment is trusted. The sightings date back to the dawn of recorded history in every country and every culture. UFOs have been around much longer than conventional aircraft, much longer than science fiction writers. There are even references in the Bible to UFO sightings. Some of this might count as evidence in a court of law, but it means very little to establishment science. Most scientists have little regard for UFOs, although few have studied the subject to any significant degree. Odd, considering that mainstream science now vigorously believes that intelligent life elsewhere in the universe is a virtual certainty. Even UFO skeptic Carl Sagan has estimated there may be more than 1 million advanced civilizations in our galaxy alone. Congressional hearings have delved into the possibility, and millions of dollars are spent each year listening for radio signals from deep space. But organized science declines to peek over the fence into its own backyard.
The probability of there being another civilization both near us and sufficiently close to us in evolution that they would either can or would be willing to communicate, seems to be a fairly rare thing. Just the probabilities suggest that would be a very rare thing.
Any scientist that takes the time to look at the data and the facts and the evidence accepts the fact that we have UFOs. You have to have an open mind if you simply make the statement that there's nothing to this thing and ignore it. The people like Carl Sagan, who's a brilliant astrophysicist, he's never bothered to read the UFO material. To him, there's nothing there, so don't bother me with the facts.
In more than 22 years as a hobby of investigating famous, mysterious UFO cases, reports, I have never found one that cannot be explained in prosaic earthly terms.
Phil Klass bills himself as the Sherlock Holmes of UFOs and is the world's preeminent debunker. He shows up at nearly all of the UFO conventions, a fly in the ET ointment. Phil Klass dartboards are best-selling items at many of those same conventions. Klass takes that as a compliment. His success at belittling or ridiculing UFO sightings is beyond question, but few people will accuse Klass of sticking to the scientific method. Even UFO doubters concede that Klass has been dead wrong in his explanations of some sightings, that he distorts astronomy for his own purposes, that he accuses UFO witnesses of being liars or hoaxsters, even though he rarely investigates any sightings personally.
Even experienced airline pilots, military pilots, can be grossly in error in what they think they've seen.
Many UFO researchers are convinced that Klass is a government agent. His years of work as editor for the well-connected aerospace mouthpiece Aviation Week and Space Technology is suspicious to some.
I cannot believe that anybody could so persistently be wrong, over and over again making claims which are false demonstrably and so forth, without having been told or doing something that he feels is in the patriotic best interest of the country. He's not so stupid. In the 50s and 60s, it was standard practice for the intelligence agencies to recruit journalists. Mr. Klass, as the outstanding example of that, was, after all, unmarried, very fast typewriter, electrical engineering background, in Washington, D.C., all kinds of contacts, a perfect person to be a spy for either side, for that matter. And so if he wasn't recruited, somebody goofed.
You ever work for the government in any capacity?
Never been paid a penny, except when my dear mother died and I got a Social Security benefit.
Phil Klass and other debunkers don't have to work very hard to create doubt about UFOs. The subject has attracted more than its share of crazies over the years. The U.S. government has officially decreed that UFOs are bunk. Science has followed suit. Have they been studied to the extent that they need to be?
I don't think they have been studied to the extent they need to be. There really should be more study, but again, the problem is most credible scientists have other things that they feel safer doing You know, just because of the fringe elements associated with UFOs.
The funding thing hanging over your head, too. I mean, you said you can't get...
Oh, hey, you apply to the National Science Foundation, you want to study UFOs, they're going to laugh and throw it out.
Without question, there is a strong streak of wacko within the UFO field. Consider the tabloid headlines wherein psychics invite aliens to a Monday night football game, or a girl gives birth to 52 UFO babies, right there alongside the capture of a green Bigfoot and the Wild Bill Hickok was gay expose. Also, psychics and channelers advertise that aliens speak to us through them. I'll tell you what, I'd like to see this sometime.
Okay, that's why I'm here, bud.
You mean you could do it now?
Right now. I want to ask for whatever information comes through to be of interest, perhaps even amusing if that's called for, and whatever energy that comes through not affect the taping. All right, Whoopah speaking. Well, I will respond to questions.
Shapiro seems sincere enough, but admits there's no way to verify his claims, and he doesn't care much whether people believe him or not. This approach is a bit too casual for science. The same is true of big-time journalism. Network coverage is quirky and condescending.
So what was it? Way up there. Heaven only knows. And that's our news.
Do you believe in UFOs? Nah.
An official Soviet government news agency has reported that a UFO landed recently near Moscow, complete with 10-foot-tall aliens from space. The reporter said his source was a group of children, and a scientist said, don't believe everything you read in TASS.
It's something that people just don't want to deal with, the press doesn't want to deal with, and people aren't going to listen to something unless Dan Rather or any of your big press people are going to tell them about it. And they're just too spooked. The Air Force has made an art form of ridiculing people who have talked about this thing.
This seeming reluctance by journalism, science, government, and religion to fully explore the possibility of extraterrestrial visits has left the job in the hands of untrained, underfunded private organizations and individuals. Invariably, such private efforts attract people whose minds are already made up and whose approach is far from professional or scientific. Ufology has made important strides in recent years, but when you consider that contact with an alien civilization would surely rank as one of the most significant events in human history, it would seem that a more organized type of study might be warranted.
If we know anything about science, it is this: the truth is always changing. What is science fiction today is science tomorrow. For instance, back in the 1800s, the scientific establishment scoffed at persistent reports from peasants and farmers and other country folk about rocks that fell from the sky. It took more than 100 years for the French Academy of Sciences to finally concede that meteorites were real. And just one generation ago, most scientists would have argued that life beyond the Earth is impossible. That is no longer the dominant viewpoint. In the days ahead, we will take you inside the government's own files to examine previously secret studies of the UFO phenomenon. We'll also try to find out if there is any connection between UFOs and the mutilations of cattle and other animals taking place across the West. We will explore what impact an alien landing might have on religion and other social institutions, and we will reveal the identity of this man who says the government has already established contact with aliens and is testing alien technology right here in Nevada.
George, you said that UFO groups have made improvements. Is ufology a real science now?
Well, they call it ufology, but even they will concede it's not really a science. It is making strides. If you take MUFON, for example, the Mutual UFO Network, they restrict their membership only to people who are invited, so you weed out some of the crackpots. Their membership has doubled in the last 2 years. They have 75 PhDs who serve not only as members but consultants. You know, there have been college courses taught on UFOs now on several campuses, and 8 PhDs have been written on the subject. So it's not a science, but it's moving in that direction.
A lot of people aren't going to believe it until they see absolute proof. What would be proof?
Well, we'll be talking about through the course of the week, but I mean, if eyewitnesses millions of eyewitnesses count as proof in other kinds of proceedings. You got photos, you got movie footage, you got video, you've got all kinds of physical manifestations, radiation, landing sites, things of that nature. You know, it's the totality is what you really have to look at, and of course we'll be taking a look at what constitutes proof through the course of the next several days.
Okay, George. Sounds great.
Forward to
Thanks.
part 2. Thank you, George.
The term flying saucer was first coined back in 1947. Businessman Kenneth Arnold, who made the first major UFO sighting of the post-war era, told reporters that the UFOs he saw near Tacoma floated across the sky like a saucer skipping across the water. The name stuck. There have been thousands of sightings since then, according to some. There have also been UFO crashes with the evidence supposedly hidden by the government. George Knapp checks out some of those claims tonight in part 2 of our series, UFOs, the best evidence. George?
Mary Ruth and Gary, we mentioned last night that there is a large body of information about UFOs. How much of this constitutes evidence is another matter altogether. In some cases, it does appear that various government officials have withheld information about UFOs from the public. In other cases, the waters have been muddied by the UFO researchers themselves. Tonight, we examine 2 of the most controversial incidents.
Billy Meier is a one-armed Swiss farmer with a 6th grade education, an unlikely choice to pull off the world's most sophisticated UFO hoax. Since 1975, Meier says, he's been in contact with cosmonauts from the Pleiades star cluster. Meier isn't the first to claim extraterrestrial visitations, but he is the first to document contact in such stunning detail, with more than 800 photographs of strange aircraft. Not the fuzzy, phony UFO photos the world is accustomed to, but clear daylight pictures of multiple flying discs and identifiable reference points in the foreground and background.
The Meier photographs were the best we'd ever seen in 40 years of record keeping. In fact, the quote we kept getting is, "They're too good to be true."
Lee Elder says he wanted his face hidden because of some ongoing security work. He also says he was coaxed into investigating the Meier case by retired Air Force Colonel Wendell Stevens. Elder, Stevens, and others spent 5 years chasing after Billy Meier's beam ships. The evidence included the photos, of course, but also film footage and sound recordings. More than 40 eyewitnesses who substantiated Meier's claims, small pieces of strange metal, and reputed landing sites with the same swirling impressions that 10 years later would be associated with UFOs in England and other countries. Instead of turning to UFO researchers, Elders and Stevens went to independent experts for their analysis. An IBM chemist concluded the strange metal was produced in a cold fusion process, a technology that only now is in its infancy on Earth. Hollywood special effects artists said the photos and film footage would be extremely difficult to fake, and computer analysis of the photos by NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab and 2 universities found no evidence of a hoax. The bottom line, outside experts independently decided the Meier material is legitimate.
I am personally 98% convinced that Meier did have visitations. 2% I reserve because it didn't happen to me.
However, the UFO community, angry at being excluded from the investigation, declared Meier a hoax. Unsubstantiated stories were circulated that the Meier photos were of models suspended from a fishing pole.
Number 1, what's his motive? It's not ego, it's not money. Number 2, how could he do it on the resources he had, $500 equivalent, Swiss francs per month? I don't think one man could hoax this case. I don't think a team of men could hoax it. How do you get 40 people to agree to a hoax over a period of time up to 8-10 years?
The Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON, also considers the Meier case to be a hoax, mainly because Meier would not cooperate with MUFON's attempted investigation. UFO hoaxes do happen. People build backyard saucers or take snapshots of flying hubcaps, but fakes are rare. Even the Air Force Project Blue Book found few phonies.
The number of hoaxes was fewer than 5%. The number of unknowns were more than 20%. The number of psychological aberrations, beautiful way to say crackpot cases, was 2%. The hoaxers may get more press than they deserve because there are a lot of lazy media people around.
It's more than lazy media, though. The Meier case, for instance, illustrates ufology's most glaring weakness, the suspicion and jealousy that permeate the field. It sometimes seems as if everyone wants to be the only one who knows the true UFO story. UFO believers end up using the same tactics as UFO skeptics, ostracizing those whose ideas don't conform. Ask John Lear. His contention that ETs are evil is so far askew from mainstream UFO thinking that some MUFON members resigned during a recent symposium rather than even listen to Lear. Lear was accused of spreading government disinformation, the most serious insult that can be made in UFO circles. Ironically, one man who made that charge, author Bill Moore, admitted at that same symposium that he had been duped into disseminating false data planted by the government. Would the government really go to such lengths to discredit UFO researchers? It has, and it does.
Some examples. The first man to make a modern sighting, Kenneth Arnold, was investigated by the FBI, CIA, and IRS. They thought he must be some sort of commie spy to make such a report. Later on, CIA experts devised a systematic program of spying on UFO organizations. In one case, a UFO club was not only infiltrated by the CIA, but CIA agents were elected as its officers. CIA scientists, pondering how to make UFO witnesses keep quiet, talked about getting Walt Disney to produce cartoons that ridiculed UFO sightings. They also planned to get broadcaster Arthur Godfrey involved at one point, and most recently, a former Air Force officer with a long history of spreading false UFO information appeared with his face hidden on a national UFO broadcast to explain that the U.S. has alien beings in its custody and that they love to eat strawberry ice cream. To some, all of this has the makings of a government conspiracy.
And that's exactly what it is. The government's been lying to the public for 42 years. It's very, very difficult to go back and say, admit that we've been lying to you.
42 years is a long time for the government to keep anything a secret, let alone something as sensational as UFOs. UFO researchers couldn't agree more. They say there have been huge cracks in the cover-up, but that the public and press haven't been listening. At the center of this whole scenario is the conservative New Mexico town, Roswell, which in 1947 was home to the Roswell Army Air Base. These days, the locals use these old airstrips to race dragsters and the old hangars as an industrial park. But 42 years ago, this is where it all began, the birthplace of what some have called the Cosmic Watergate. What happened on that night in July 1947 sounds like the plot of an old science fiction movie. Residents saw a bright object streak across the sky. 70 miles out of town, it exploded, scattering debris over a large area. Rancher Mac Brazel found the strange metallic fragments and days later reported the matter to authorities. Roswell intelligence officer Major Jesse Marcel was dispatched to the scene to collect the wreckage.
One thing I was certain of, being familiar with all air activities, that it was not a weather balloon, nor an aircraft, nor a missile. It was something else of which we didn't know what it was.
Marcel said the thin foil-like metal was virtually indestructible, with strange hieroglyphics written on it. In his words, it was not of this earth. Base Commander Colonel William Blanchard, certainly familiar with all aircraft of the day, agreed. He called up his press liaison, Lieutenant Walter Hott.
He called and said words to this effect: "We've got pieces of what we think is a flying saucer."
Hott wrote and released a story that was immediately picked up by newspapers and wire services, spurring phone calls from all over the world. Major Marcel was told to load the wreckage into a B-29 and fly it to Wright Field in Ohio. He landed first at 8th Air Force Headquarters in Fort Worth, where General Roger Ramey took control of the debris, ordered Marcel and others to keep quiet, and issued another news release saying the debris was actually from a crashed weather balloon. As he and Marcel posed for reporters with debris from a balloon, the real wreckage, according to witnesses, was flown under armed guard to Ohio.
The newsmen saw very little of that material, a very small portion of it. And none of the important things, like these members that had these hieroglyphics or markings on. And when the general came in, he told me not to say anything, that he would handle it.
The story held for 30 years until Stan Friedman and his colleagues started digging. They found more than 100 witnesses with first or second-hand knowledge of the Roswell incident. They also believe that the debris was from an alien spacecraft that crashed miles beyond the Brazel Ranch. Numerous witnesses say they saw the crashed disc, the bodies of dead aliens inside. But the military seized the evidence and swore them to secrecy. Walter Hott says flat out the story of the weather balloon was a cover-up. So does Bob Shirkey. Shirkey was the officer who ordered up the B-29 that transported the strange debris. He saw the wreckage and thinks if it really was from a weather balloon, it wouldn't have been flown to Ohio in such a hurry. Shirky also has knowledge of the alien bodies. The information is from a close friend who ran the town funeral parlor in the 40s. It has never been made public until now.
Did you see the sketches in the paper of the humanoids or the bodies? And I said, yes. He says, well, I can tell you that's what they look like. Says our funeral parlor supplied the caskets for the Air Force to use because we had the contract. And they came in and took all the baby-sized or youth-sized caskets we had.
What would an alien spacecraft be doing in Roswell in the first place? Well, in the late 40s and early 50s, New Mexico had more UFO sightings than any other place in the world. Consider one possible explanation. It was at Los Alamos that the atomic bomb was developed and built. The Trinity site is where the first A-bomb was detonated. White Sands is where all post-war missile tests were conducted, and Roswell was home to the 509th, the only atomic bomb wing in the world. If an alien intelligence wanted to learn about human military capabilities, New Mexico was the place to be. The strange sightings and somewhat flimsy excuses continued long after the alleged Roswell crash. Lonnie James was an Air Force radar operator in Roswell in the 50s. He recalls at least 3 instances when UFOs were picked up on radar and seen from the ground. Jets were scrambled, but they couldn't get close.
The sweep on the radar comes around every 5 seconds. The rate of speed was so great, we could not, it disappeared off the radar before we could get a, check the speed on them.
How fast is that?
Well, it was well over 2,000, well over.
The official explanation for what James and others saw, the ubiquitous excuse, weather balloons.
I think you know as well as I do, George, that weather balloons do not behave in that fashion.
Of course, UFO buffs smell a cover-up. But what about the level-headed people of Roswell? Do they believe that a flying saucer crashed outside their town?
I don't know percentage-wise what the difference would be, but I think after the recent exposure, I think that really a lot of people believe it.
An odd footnote to the story. In September, the Roswell incident was featured on the NBC program Unsolved Mysteries. Within days of that broadcast, the people of Roswell started seeing weather balloons. During our interview with Walter Hott, a weather balloon floated over his backyard. Another was spotted on the drive from Roswell to Albuquerque. Is there a vital need for weather data in the New Mexican desert, or is someone trying to prove something? Former U.S. Senator Barry Goldwater thinks there's something fishy about the whole story. As chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee and an Air Force general, Goldwater had a top-secret security clearance. During a visit to Wright-Patterson Air Base in Ohio, he asked to view the hangar where the Roswell wreckage and other UFO information were reportedly stored. Permission was denied. Goldwater later wrote that he was told the matter was classified above top secret. He was also told to never ask again. What does the government know that it isn't telling us? Tomorrow, we'll delve into the government's own files to find out if the cover-up is real and ongoing. And later, we'll reveal the identity of this man who says the government is flying alien craft in the Nevada desert.
It's not only a crime against the American people, it's a crime against the scientific community.
Speculation about some long-standing government cover-up is tough for many people to swallow. Tomorrow, as we mentioned, we'll look at files obtained through the Freedom of Information Act to see if there's a real basis for the cover-up allegations.
Back to the first part of the story, Billy Meyer, the one-armed farmer. What happened to him?
He's still alive, living on his farm in Switzerland, but we understand from Lee Elders that things have changed considerably for him, that he's real despondent these days, and these visits from the Pleiadian cosmonauts, if they ever happened, have stopped.
What do UFO critics say about the Roswell incident?
Well, Phil Klass, for example, of course, who buys none of this stuff, he basically says that all of the witnesses involved are lying. Either they're lying or they're hoaxsters. Of course, it's also been proven that of the over 100 people with first or second-hand degree knowledge of the Roswell incident, not one has been interviewed by Phil Klass.
Interesting. Thank you, George.
See you tomorrow night.
UFO researchers have long suspected that a government cover-up has prevented the public from knowing the full story about visitors from other planets. In 1973, for instance, the director of the FBI denied that his agency had ever investigated UFOs.
In 1976, the agency released more than 1,100 pages of UFO information that it had collected over many years. What forced the disclosure? It was the Freedom of Information Act. Tonight, in part 3 of our series, UFOs, the Best Evidence, George Knapp reports on other secrets that have been pried out of the government.
UFO skeptics often ask, if there are aliens visiting Earth, why don't they announce themselves by flying over the White House? The answer is, UFOs did fly over the White House twice. It happened in July 1952. As the New York Times reported, 7 eerie glowing objects were spotted by pilots in the air and people on the ground. 12 different radar operators tracked the UFOs at speeds of up to 7,000 miles per hour. A week later, the objects were back again. When jets were scrambled, the lights either disappeared or zoomed away. The Air Force explained that what everyone had seen was a temperature inversion. To a man, the radar operators disagreed, but the official explanation is the one that stuck. Government explanations of UFOs are often just plain wrong. In 1965, thousands of people from Canada to Mexico watched a formation of UFOs maneuver in the skies. The Air Force said it was the constellation Orion, even though at the time Orion could only be seen from the other side of the planet. A UFO landing at White Sands Missile Base was said to be a sighting of the planet Venus, to which one UFO buff responded, "It was unforgettable the night Venus landed on the gypsum flats of New Mexico."
The standing joke in UFO circles is that for every 200 UFO sightings, the Air Force can explain away 201. The possibility that our government might withhold or distort information about UFOs might seem far-fetched until you read the mountains of evidence compiled from the government's own files, evidence that strongly suggests a cover-up.
The U.S. military first started seeing UFOs in World War II. Pilots called them Foo fighters. We thought they were a German secret weapon. The Germans thought they were ours. An explosion of civilian sightings in 1947 caught the military by surprise. Secret investigations were begun. A joint study by the FBI and Army concluded the flying saucer situation is not all imaginary. Something is really flying around. That report was kept secret until 1976.
Yes, there was a degree of secrecy. In certain cases, there might be sightings on radar, and we didn't want the Russians to know we had a radar here or a radar there.
Class is correct, but only to a point, because most of the early UFO sightings were by eyewitnesses, not radar. In New Mexico, for instance, over a 2-year period, dozens of people reported seeing green fireballs over sensitive military installations. But when radar and cameras were dispatched to those installations, the fireballs mysteriously shifted someplace else. A 1949 study by scientists at Los Alamos Lab stated the fireballs deserve serious consideration.
Come on, we gotta get him. Wait, let him go. They'll never believe him. You fools, you're in danger! Can't you see? They're after you! They're after all of us! They're here already!
Some have suggested the saucer craze of the 40s and 50s was a byproduct of Cold War tensions and fears. Both the U.S. and the USSR conducted secret studies to find out if the other side was behind the UFOs, and both concluded early on that the capabilities of the flying discs seemed beyond human technology. This secret report, done in 1948 by the Air Force and Naval Intelligence, is among the most fascinating UFO documents ever to surface, because it wasn't supposed to exist. A confidential memo at the end of the report ordered that all copies should be destroyed, but one copy survived and was finally pried out of the Pentagon in 1985. It's a study of more than 200 of the earliest UFO sightings, including one that occurred in June 1947 near Lake Mead. An Air Force pilot saw a formation of 6 UFOs. The report notes the UFOs are some type of flying craft, not weather balloons or hallucinations, that sighting reports were made by experienced personnel, and that the origin of flying saucers is not ascertainable. The overall effort to study saucers was called Project Sign, with headquarters at Wright Field in Ohio. In 1949, Sign personnel wrote a top-secret report concluding UFOs were extraterrestrial craft. When the report made it to the desk of Chief of Staff General Hoyt Vandenberg, though, he rejected it and ordered all copies burned. This rejection from the top was, in the view of many, the death knell for objective study of UFOs. A few weeks later, Project Sign produced another final report saying its findings were inconclusive. That report was accepted, and soon after, Project Sign became Project Grudge. Grudge evaluated reports on the premise that UFOs could not exist. According to a later report by the Library of Congress, it was the job of Grudge to explain them all. Despite this slant, 23% of Grudge cases remained a mystery. Grudge staffers decided these cases were psychologically motivated. The first official declaration that people who see UFOs UFOs are crazy.
The government established an intensive program of ridicule against anyone who said they saw flying saucers, and fear of ridicule was the foundation on which the cover-up was placed. Nobody likes to be ridiculed.
The sightings continued nonetheless. In 1952, there were more sightings than the 5 previous years combined, including the Washington, D.C. incidents. Yet another study was launched, Project Blue Book. Blue Book today is notorious in UFO circles as a whitewash. There is considerable evidence the project was far from objective. The man appointed to head Blue Book, Captain Edward Rappelt, says he was told in the very beginning that the powers that be are anti-flying saucer. To stay in favor, it behooves one to follow suit. Rappelt later resigned from the military and wrote a book about what he says was the Blue Book cover-up and the reality of flying saucers. The continued increase in UFO sightings was a source of concern to the CIA, and a new strategy was born, debunking. A group of CIA-connected scientists was assembled in secret to evaluate UFOs. The so-called Robertson panel spent all of 12 hours in a roundtable discussion about a handful of UFO cases. The panel concluded that UFOs are not a threat to national security, but that continued reporting of UFOs is a threat. The recommendation? The government should take immediate steps to strip UFOs of their aura of mystery through a program of public education. The final report even used the term debunking. The debunking included spying on UFO witnesses and the infiltration of UFO organizations by the CIA and FBI. The Air Force tried to insinuate that saucers were earthly inventions by leaking information about an unwieldy craft called the Avro Disc.
A 2-seater ready soon may be the car or chopper of the future. Help wanted, a crew of little green men.
The strategy included the silencing of military personnel through intimidation. Bill Cooper served in both the Air Force and the Navy and says he and 3 other sailors witnessed a UFO off the coast of Hawaii.
When we arrived back in port, we were debriefed by Office of Naval Intelligence officer who basically the gist of the debriefing was is you didn't see anything and you're not going to talk about anything, and if you do, you're going to be in deep trouble.
A similar order was issued to hundreds of airmen at a base in Alaska who watched 2 UFOs play cat and mouse with Air Force jets. One witness, who asked to remain anonymous, recalls the order that was issued.
A gag order, in essence, that what you thought you saw and heard on the previous day to this directive, you did not see and you did not hear. And it did not happen.
Even retired military personnel have felt the squeeze.
If you were of my vintage and you were retired from the military and someone said you open your mouth and that's the end of your retirement pay, you think not only once, you think quite a few times.
For 3 decades, the military has publicly scoffed at UFOs, but it's been another matter behind the scenes. A secret order issued to Air Force base commanders in 1960 stated UFOs should be treated as, quote, serious business, directly related to national security. Public pressure spurred Congress to hold hearings about UFOs in the mid-60s, and the Air Force decided enough is enough. It commissioned what was to be the ultimate UFO study, conducted by Edward Condon of the University of Colorado. Condon was a respected scientist, but was hardly impartial about UFOs. Before the study even began, he said in a speech that the government should get out of the UFO business. There's nothing to it. He later wrote the authors of UFO books should be horsewhipped. There is even evidence that the study's conclusions were written before the project even began. To the surprise of few, the committee declared that further study of UFOs would be a waste of time. The Air Force used this as its reason to finally end Project Blue Book.
None of the evidence that I have examined would indicate any proof at all that we are being visited by extraterrestrials.
We have not been hiding anything. The investigations have been made public.
Call up an Air Force base today to report a UFO and you'll be told the military no longer collects such information. It all ended with Blue Book. Government documents contradict these statements. A 1969 order by Air Force General C.H. Bolander reveals that UFO reports which could affect national security are not part of the Blue Book system and should continue to be handled through standard Air Force procedure. UFO researchers have long suspected that Blue Book was merely for public consumption, that another secret UFO program existed to handle the most sensitive cases. The Bolander memo may verify these suspicions. There are other indications that the policy continues. Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque has been the site of numerous UFO incidents, including 4 separate incidents in August 1980. Security police reported UFO landings in and around nuclear weapons storage areas. Base radar equipment was knocked out during the landings. A secret Air Force report about the incident states the Air Force is no longer publicly active in UFO research, but still has an interest in all UFO sightings over Air Force installations. The document also reveals that several other government agencies actively investigate legitimate sightings through covert cover. Does this mean CIA? The CIA responds to UFO requests in this fashion. There is no CIA program to actively collect information on UFOs, nor has there been one since the 1950s. This statement flies in the face of numerous reports squeezed out of the agency by Freedom of Information lawsuits. A series of internal memos dated 1976 make repeated references to UFO research, UFO studies, CIA UFO experts, and agency personnel who are monitoring the UFO phenomenon. The reluctance to admit an interest in UFOs dates back at least to 1952. An internal letter from CIA's weapons chief states it is strongly urged that no indication of CIA interest reach the press or public in light of their alarmist tendencies. Officially, CIA and other government agencies say their lack of interest is because UFOs pose no threat to national security. Yet UFOs have made alarming intrusions at our most sensitive military bases. As the Washington Post reported, UFOs visited 5 separate nuclear missile launch sites near the Canadian border during a 2-week period in 1975, one right after the other. In at least one case, the UFOs tampered with the launch codes of ICBM missiles. Fighter planes were unable to catch the UFOs, which makes the government explanation that these were mystery helicopters seem specious. Mystery helicopters that can outrace F-16s visiting nuclear missile bases? If this isn't national security, what is? Oddly, the government has used the national security excuse to withhold UFO data. Stan Friedman and others fought all the way to the Supreme Court to get UFO documents from the National Security Agency. All they got was a summary of the documents.
Here it is, legal affidavit, NSA, and so forth. The trouble is, as you start to go through this document, you rather quickly find that a lot of it isn't really there. And I won't stop because you'll see how many pages are really full of good information. To make a long story short, approximately 75% of this document isn't there.
It's the biggest secret in the history of mankind, and the government is not going to let this out.
Who's not going to let it out? Is there a secret government within the government? And what, if anything, do UFOs have to do with the mutilation of cattle in Nevada and elsewhere? More on these topics tomorrow. George Knapp, Eyewitness News 8.
Tomorrow night, George continues a look at the UFOs and the debate about their existence.
Part 4 focuses on numerous encounters between UFOs and American astronauts.
One of the most persistent stories surrounding the UFO phenomenon is that UFOs have made a practice of following American space missions. Several astronauts have been quoted about the deep space encounters, but there has been no official confirmation of such contact. Tonight, in Part 4 of UFOs, The Best Evidence, George Knapp looks at NASA policies regarding ETs. He'll also find out if there is a connection between UFOs and the mutilation of thousands of animals. We should warn you that some of the photos you're about to see are graphic.
In March 1989, the crew of the Space Shuttle Discovery may have discovered something unexpected. A ham radio operator claims to have picked up the voice of Discovery pilot Colonel John Blaha speaking on a secret NASA channel.
Houston, this is Discovery. We still have the alien spacecraft under observance.
Is this really the voice of Blaha claiming to have an alien spacecraft under observance? Listen to the recording again, then listen to Blaha during a later transmission.
Houston, this is Discovery. We still have the alien spacecraft under observance.
It's a shame we can't be here all the time with a permanent manned space station. We ought to get in that direction.
NASA says it is not the voice of Blaha. However, UFOs have reportedly dogged the U.S. space program since the very beginning. UFO researchers claim that NASA's own logs show that virtually all of the early Gemini and Apollo missions encountered UFOs. NASA has explained most of these sightings as space debris or solar flares, but some of its own astronauts have disagreed. UFO sightings have been reported by James Lovell, James McDivitt, Wally Schirra, Deke Slayton, Gordon Cooper, and others. Cooper went so far as to write a letter in 1978 to a United Nations panel on UFOs, saying that he and others had seen UFOs, but that astronauts are very reluctant to discuss the topic. He also stated these are extraterrestrial vehicles visiting this planet from other planets. Cooper has since recanted his statements, but won't say why. Attempts were made to contact Cooper and the other astronauts, but no responses were received. NASA's official policy states that it is not engaged in any UFO research, nor is any other government agency. Still, it's interesting to note that NASA has, since 1977, been the government's only official mouthpiece for UFO information. It's also true that NASA has extensive written policies governing encounters with extraterrestrial life forms, and agency documents contain suggested procedures that should be followed in the event that contact is made with an ET civilization. UFO researchers believe these policies were created because the government knows a lot more about alien life forms than it's telling us. If there is a cover-up, who is calling the shots? Many people believe that there's a secret government within the government, something called MJ-12 or Magic 12 or Majestic. This document is easily the most controversial in UFO circles. It is supposedly a briefing document prepared in 1952 for President-elect Dwight Eisenhower, explaining that a secret group of scientists and military men had been created by President Truman to study the UFO situation and to keep a lid on it. The chief scientist in MJ-12 was said to have been presidential science advisor Dr. Vannevar Bush.
If it's a legitimate document, it establishes, one, that a flying saucer crashed, two, that the wreckage was recovered, 1947, three, that the government has successfully kept that secret since that time, four, that a very high-level group, including, as it happens, the first four directors of Central Intelligence, first Secretary of Defense, etc., was set up, established to deal with that.
Friedman was given a $16,000 grant by a UFO group to research the legitimacy of the MJ-12 document. He has since found other government memos that refer to MJ-12, as well as additional supporting material. However, arguments about the legitimacy of the briefing document have raged in UFO circles for years. Arguments about such minutiae as typewriter brands, date placements, and phraseology.
I've tried to deal with every argument, and there are dozens that have been made by the noisy negativists. All kinds of format and style, and they wouldn't have done this, that, or the other thing. I've found that none of those arguments stand up.
However, Philip Klass and others have cast so many aspersions on the MJ-12 document that even die-hard UFO buffs now doubt its legitimacy. But they don't automatically reject everything in it. Whoever forged it, if it's a forgery, may have included enough real information to confuse things, and perhaps to lead researchers on a wild alien chase. There is independent confirmation of some of the MJ-12 details from highly reliable sources. Wilbert Smith, a respected scientist for the Canadian government in the 1950s, wrote this top-secret memo to his superiors, describing his talks with American scientists. Said Smith, in the U.S., the matter is classified higher than the H-bomb. Flying saucers do exist, and they're being studied by a small group headed by Vannevar Bush. This memo was enough to convince the Canadian government to establish its own UFO study program just 2 weeks later. Another source of confirmation is Dr. Robert Sarbacher, president of the Washington Institute of Technology, a key member of the Manhattan Project, and a scientist of impeccable credentials. In this 1983 letter, Sarbacher admitted matter-of-factly that Vannevar Bush was involved with secret UFO research, that crashed disks and alien bodies had been recovered, and that UFOs were highly classified. Even UFO skeptics have had difficulty giving Sarbacher the brush off. If there is or was an MJ-12, it may have had good reasons for keeping UFOs a secret. Perhaps most compelling is that humans can't presume to know why aliens are here, if they are here. The behavior ascribed to ETs by various witnesses is so foreign to us as to seem unfathomable. One of the weirdest activities attributed to aliens is the bizarre mutilation of animals. Scattered stories of carved-up livestock and strange lights in the sky date back to the 1890s in the U.S., but it wasn't until the early 1970s that a pattern began to emerge. A mutilation explosion rocked Midwestern, then Western states. Then, as now, the main targets were cows, although horses, deer, pigs, goats, and other animals have received similar treatment. Today, nearly 15,000 mutilation reports have been received. Most often, the phantom surgeons remove sex organs, udders, rectums, eyes, or ears. The carcasses are usually drained of blood, but blood is rarely found on the ground. There are occasional burn marks on or around the dead beasts, and the cutting is performed with scalpel-like precision.
It's hard to visualize or even comprehend why someone would drive up and kill an animal and then take the male parts out. I don't know. It's beyond me to, it's beyond me to understand it.
Former State Senator Floyd Lamb has lost 2 prize bulls to the mystery mutilations. Like many ranchers, he's self-reliant and didn't bother to file police reports. His Lincoln County ranch sits adjacent to the Nevada test site, so he's seen his share of odd things over the years, but he hasn't got a clue about who is carving up cattle.
I don't know I don't understand that. Some kook.
Lamb has several neighbors who've also lost cattle. Most of those weren't reported either. In all of Lincoln County, we could find only 6 official mutilation reports dating back to 1975. But many people we talked to had heard of others.
Oh yes, there was several. I hesitate to give a figure, but several.
This is Jane Bradshaw's ranch. She's filed 2 reports of mutilated cows in 8 years. One of the mutilations occurred just yards away from her house. No one heard or saw anything, and as is normal, there were no tracks found. Still, Bradshaw and her children surmised that devil worshippers with poison dart guns were responsible.
You don't just walk up to a big healthy animal like this and tell it to lay down. You know, you've got to do something to it. And it wasn't shot. It wasn't stabbed. I mean, it wasn't killed in any way. So it'd have to have been some kind of a dart or sleeping thing to make it fall.
Roving bands of shadowy Satan worshippers are frequently mentioned as possible culprits in the mutilations. Some researchers insist there just aren't enough devil worshippers out there, especially in rural areas, to commit such widespread mayhem. Former Lincoln County Sheriff Larry Wilkinson personally investigated 3 mutilation cases. He dismisses the notion of knife-wielding Beelzebubs because of the sophistication involved.
The cuts that were made up the legs and the inside of the legs and up the belly. Looked like you could have taken a zipper and zipped the cow right back together again. They were 1/8 serrated cuts were made on the cow. We cut down into the animal and found out that the ball joint was gone, completely gone, off just that one shoulder, and just a perfectly flat cut inside. No bone chips, nothing that you would get from a meat saw where you're leaving pieces of bone part or anything like that. It was cut, I don't know how.
Some government researchers have blamed predators for some mutilations, but the likelihood of a mountain lion making an incision like a cookie cutter seems remote, and coyotes have never fared well against living, breathing cows. The Bradshaw family insists that neither predators nor any other animal was responsible because not even maggots would come near the carcasses.
Several weeks later, I think the coyotes finally did touch the animal's head, you know, try eating on its head, but they wouldn't touch the body, which is odd because they're scavengers and they'll eat anything.
Documentary filmmaker Linda Howe refers to the mutilations as an alien harvest. Howe has followed up on hundreds of cases and says whatever cut open these cattle didn't use a knife or pinking shears. Pathologists have told Howe that the cuts went between rather than through the animal's microscopic cells. A laser capable of doing such work would approximate the size of an office desk, hard to cart out into an open pasture. Howe's investigations have found an unusually high correlation between mutilations and UFO sightings. In some cases, the strange lights in the sky are soon followed by mystery helicopters, leading some to speculate that the UFO mutilators are being monitored themselves by someone with a lot of helicopters. The lack of blood or tracks, the sophistication of the cuts, occasional tripod-like indentations found near the bodies. To Howe and others, this all adds up to UFOs.
I've never counted UFOs out, and I still don't to this day.
I've seen some weird things over this mountain at night. That's towards the test site.
What do they do?
Well, I just remember some kind of a bright light going up and coming down.
Whitley Strieber, who's written 2 best-selling books about alien abductions of humans, doesn't think the mutilations of cows are so weird.
It could be that if they are visitors from another planet, they use the cattle for the same reason we do. And it's true that the things that are done to the cattle are quite horrible, but if you think the visitors are the only ones doing horrible things to cattle, I recommend that you visit a slaughterhouse.
But is it food or some other use the UFOs have for cows? Scientists have only recently discovered a remarkable similarity between the chromosomes of cattle and of people. The possibility of some genetic experiment associated with this strange harvest is enough to make one shudder. The proximity of the Lincoln County incidents to the Nevada test site and the ultra-secret Area 51 is also of interest to some. There's a long-standing suspicion that Area 51 is an alien haven, a place where UFOs drift through the night sky. The stories recently prompted radio host Billy Goodman to organize a field trip to the outskirts of 51. Nearly 100 people unfolded their lawn chairs, unfurled their American flags, and sat back to await E.T.
What we need is a real, strong, positive attitude. When you get yourself in position, zero in on your area and try to make something come your way.
They don't get clouds in the summertime out here. They don't get much rain out here. This is a classic mothership appearance.
But those expecting a mothership were somewhat disappointed. On this night, there were several false sightings, car lights, stars, and other explainable objects. And it all took place under the watchful eye of Lincoln County deputies.
Well, I came up here to try and see if I could see some UFOs, basically.
But I've driven further on for a lot crazier things.
Straight up.
Straight up.
It's moving. Look how fast it's going. I knew. My ears rang when it came over.
Despite the ringing ears, no flying saucers were seen while our camera was present, but the faithful say they saw unexplainable lights later that night. These days, Area 51, adjacent to Groom Lake, has become a nightly desert hangout for UFO believers. Is it a modern folk legend, or is something really going on here? Tomorrow, a scientist who says he worked on flying saucers. George Knapp, Eyewitness News 8.
I guess we'll get more on that tomorrow.
This week in our series of reports on UFOs, we learned a number of things. That not everybody who sees a UFO is crazy, that our government has lied about UFO information, that it's withheld UFO files, and even spied on UFO witnesses. We've also heard from scientists who say life elsewhere in the universe is virtually a certainty. And we heard that a majority of Americans believe that UFOs are real and come from space. Tonight, in Part 5 of his report, George Knapp introduces us to a local man with an amazing and disturbing story. George.
Gary and Mary Ruth, we've been working on this story for a long time, and we'll tell you right up front that it's going to be hard to swallow at first. This week, we've heard the contention of UFO researchers that there's a secret government within our government. While that may be hard to believe coming from the UFO perspective, we've certainly learned in Watergate and the Iran-Contra scandal that factions within our government can and do pursue their own hidden agendas outside of the law, outside the control of Congress, or the knowledge of the American people. This is exactly the type of operation we'll hear about tonight. It's a chilling scenario with worldwide implications that may have its roots right here. Area 51, that mysterious corner of the Nevada test site, is no longer much of a secret. The fact that secretive things go on here is a given, even to the Soviets, who make daily spy flights over the facility to take a peek at what's going on. These photos, never before shown in public, are about as close as anyone will ever come to seeing what the place looks like again. The dry bed of Groom Lake, corrugated metal buildings, a 3-mile-long runway, and some highly sophisticated radar and detection equipment. It's been known by many names over the years: Dreamland, the Ranch, the Skunk Works. If ever there was a place to test a secret new technology, this is it. And that's exactly what's been done here for decades. Area 51 is where Francis Gary Powers and the other U-2 pilots were trained in the 50s, and where the U-2 itself was developed. The SR-71 spy planes that spotted Soviet missiles in Cuba in the early 60s were also developed at 51. 51 is where stealth technology was nurtured, where Star Wars devices are still tested, and where all manner of CIA monkey business has been plotted and refined. It's the perfect place for secret things, but of course, that's no secret. 51 is ringed by the forbidden vastness of the Nevada test site, by the looming Groom Mountains, and by sparsely populated desert expanses. The few people who do live out here have no love lost for the military, but they're conservative, patriotic, and they mind their own business. You ever see stuff you can't explain?
Sure, lots of stuff.
Care to elaborate?
No.
Happy anniversary to you.
On any given night at the Rachel Bar and Grill, you might find 3 or 4 people who work at Area 51, there amid the flowing Budweisers and cowboy hats. You might find them, but they aren't going to talk to you, not about the things they've seen over the mountains. A steady trickle of curiosity seekers flows through here, strangers drawn by strange stories of lights in the night sky. Their questions also go unanswered. No one who's worked at Dreamland has ever publicly acknowledged what so many people have suspected for years, that alien technology is being tested in the Nevada desert. The speculation first surfaced in documents obtained by UFO researchers, documents about something called Project Aquarius. The documents, allegedly prepared for an organization called MJ-12, state that a program to fly recovered alien spacecraft was established in 1972 and is continuing in Nevada. The National Security Agency has confirmed it does have a Project Aquarius, but denies it has anything to do with flying saucers. NSA will not say what Project Aquarius is. Speculation was heightened in 1984 when the Air Force seized nearly 90,000 acres around Groom Lake. The action was, by most accounts, illegal. During congressional hearings about the land grab, Congressman John Seiberling grilled the military about the legal authority used in the action and was told the authority was at a much, much higher level than the Air Force. Seiberling asked what authority is higher than the laws of the United States. The Air Force official said he could respond, but only in a closed briefing. In 1987, when the Air Force sought to renew its stranglehold on the Groom Range, news articles once again mentioned the talk about alien spacecraft, and subsequent articles in national magazines quoted unnamed sources about things of alien origin flying in Nevada, things that would make filmmaker George Lucas drool. Despite the speculation, no one who knew Area 51 from the inside ever talked publicly about the saucer stories.
Well, there's several, actually 9 flying saucers, flying discs, that are out there of extraterrestrial origin.
The live interview with the shadowy Dennis drew international attention. Portions were broadcast by radio in 6 European countries and in a nationally televised TV special in Japan.
Actually 9 flying saucers, flying discs.
Despite numerous inquiries and feelers, Dennis has remained anonymous until now. His real name is Robert Lazar, a young scientist with eclectic interests. The choice of Dennis was an inside joke. He says that's the name of his superior at Groom Lake. It wasn't a joke to Dennis.
He called right after and he said, "Do you have any idea what we're going to do to you now?" And I said, "Well, no." And he hung up the phone.
Lazar's story is by any standards fantastic. He says he's telling it in order to protect himself. He says he was hired to work at an area called S4, which is a few miles south of Groom Lake. At S4, he says, are flying saucers, antimatter reactors, and other working examples of technology that is seemingly beyond human capabilities.
Right, this came from somewhere else. I mean, as bizarre as that is to believe, but I mean, it's there. I saw it. I know what the current state of the art is in physics, and it can't be done.
Checking out Lazar's credentials proved to be a difficult task. He says he earned degrees in physics and electronics, but the schools we contacted say they've never heard of him. He also said he worked as a physicist at Los Alamos National Lab, where he experimented with one of the world's largest particle beam accelerators, a half-mile-long behemoth capable of generating 700 million volts. Los Alamos officials told us they had no records of a Robert Lazar ever working there. They were either mistaken or were lying. A 1982 phone book from the lab lists Lazar right there among the other scientists and technicians. A 1982 clipping from the Los Alamos newspaper profiled Lazar and his interest in jet cars. It, too, mentioned his employment at the lab as a physicist. We called Los Alamos again. An exasperated official told us he still had no records on Lazar. EG&G, which is where Lazar says he was interviewed for the job at S4, also has no records. It's as if someone has made him disappear.
Well, they're trying to make me a non-person.
Explain. You called where?
Well, the schools that I went to, the hospital that I was born at, past job, and essentially nothing comes up with my name in it.
He smiles, but out of futility, knowing the whole thing must sound ridiculous. According to Lazar, his employer was the United States Navy. He says he and other government employees would gather near EG&G, fly to Groom Lake, then a very few people would get into a bus with blacked out or no windows and drive to S4.
When you get off the bus, what do you see? It's a very interesting building. It's got a slope of probably about 30 degrees, which are hangar doors. and it has textured paint on it, but it looks like sand. It's made to look like the side of the mountain that it's in, whether it's to disguise it from satellite photographs or what.
He says he was never told exactly what he'd be working on, but figured it had something to do with advanced propulsion. On his first day, he was told to read a series of briefings and immediately realized how advanced the propulsion was.
The power source is an antimatter reactor. They run gravity amplifiers. There's actually 2 parts to the drive mechanism. It's a bizarre technology. There's no physical hookup between any of the systems in there. They use gravity as a wave using waveguides, almost like microwaves.
It took a while, Lazar says, before he actually saw one of the flying discs. However, there were hints everywhere.
Right, they had a poster, and it looked like a commercial poster almost, like it was lithographed and you could buy it at a Kmart or something. But they were all over the place, and it had the disc that I coined the term the sport model was lifted off the ground about 3 feet at area S4 on the dry lake there, and the caption on the bottom said, "They're here." And those are just all over the place.
Later, he got to see the real thing.
When I was let in, it was the first time I saw the sport model in the hangar sitting down, and I was told they could have walked me in the front door, but they purposely wanted to walk me by it. I was told not to say anything and just keep my eyes forward and walk past the disc into the office area. And I did, and as we went by it, I just kind of stuck my hands on it just to run it alongside the thing, and you know, that was about the smallest time. After that, I got to see it actually lift off the ground and operate.
But you also, in between that, you saw more than one.
Yeah. The hangars are all connected together, and there are large bay doors between each one. And there were 9 total that I saw, each one being different. Like they had the assortment pack.
Security at S4 was oppressive, Lazar says, and his superiors used fear and intimidation almost as a brainwashing tool.
It did everything but physically hurt me.
Put a gun to your head?
Yeah.
And said what? Actually put a gun to your head?
Well, they did that even in the original security briefings. They had guards there with M16s, and guys slamming their finger into my chest, screaming in my ear, some people pointing weapons at me. Like I said, it's not a good place to work.
That fear factor would surface later. Lazar agreed to undergo a polygraph exam as part of this report. Polygrapher Ron Slay asked about the technology Lazar had seen.
Did you knowingly lie when you said you had actually seen anti-gravity propulsion in operation?
No.
The results of this exam were inconclusive. Lazar appeared to be truthful on one test, deceitful on a second. Slay recommended that a second examiner be brought in. Polygrapher Terry Tavernetti runs a corporate security operation and is a former Los Angeles police officer. He put Lazar through 4 tests and concluded there was no attempt to deceive.
And I left there thinking that I feel we do have some credibility to what the subject had to say. And that's when I went to some of my colleagues.
Tavernetti sent the test results to a 3rd polygrapher who agreed the results appeared truthful. The charts were then sent to a 4th examiner who did not agree, suggesting Lazar might be relating information he'd learned from someone else. The polygraphers conferred and decided they would not issue a final statement on truthfulness until more specific testing can be conducted, and that's where it stands. Tavernetti believes that difficulty in determining Lazar's truthfulness stems from the fear that was drilled into him.
I think we're talking about a subject here that is so far-reaching, and it is so emotional. And when you're dealing with emotions, this is polygraph, because we're dealing, in polygraph, you're looking at fear. The fear of getting caught telling a lie because something bad will happen to you if you do.
Well, I am telling the truth. I've tried to prove that. What's going on up there could be the most important event in history. You're talking about contact, physical contact and proof from another system, another planet, another intelligence. That's got to be the biggest event in history, period.
And it's real.
And it's real and it's there. And I had an extremely small part in it, but I'm convinced that what I saw is absolute proof of that. There is no way we could have created those systems. There's no way we could have made the discs, the power supplies, anything to go with them.
Lazar says he has no intention of going on any UFO lecture circuit. He's not looking to do any additional interviews. In fact, he wasn't too crazy about doing this one. He did it after certain unfavorable things started happening in his life, and he did it because he feels that whoever is running the show up at S4 is perpetrating a fraud on the American people and on the scientific community. We intend to have much more about this story, about the operation up there, on Monday and beyond. This is by no means the end of this series of reports. In fact, on Monday, including in our story there, support testimony from other people who say they have knowledge of the flying discs at the test site, and information from people who know Lazar very well and insist his story is true.
If indeed they have these flying saucers, George, it seems like it would be really hard to keep it so secret.
Well, yeah, it would seem that way, except for as Lazar asked his superiors up there, they say it's the easiest secret in the world to keep. It's leaked out many times before and nobody believes it.
What's the Navy saying about all of this?
Well, of course, the Navy is supposed to have been his employer, and we have put some fairly pointed questions to them. Of course, number one, it may not be the Navy at all. Information is so compartmentalized up there, no one is exactly sure who is in charge. We have put the questions to several Navy departments. The answers thus far have been unsatisfactory. We've applied for more information through the Freedom of Information Act, and that information will be revealed on Monday as well.
You believe his story, don't you?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I've got to know him pretty well over the last couple of months, and I believe he's telling the truth.
Fascinating stuff. Thanks, you, George. Former government scientist has alleged that the U.S. military is flying recovered UFOs at a secret base in the Nevada desert. The allegations about the secret facility near the Groom Mountains first surfaced on Eyewitness News last Friday.
Scientist Bob Lazar says there are at least 9 of the flying saucers being tested and that they were not built on Earth. George Knapp has more in the continuation of our series on UFOs.
Yeah, well, it's obvious it came from somewhere else other than Earth.
Scientist Bob Lazar is convinced that the technology he saw being tested at a secret base in the Nevada desert is of alien origin, and for Lazar, the proof is at least partially in the furniture. One of the 9 flying discs he says he saw at the base, which was designated S4, looks exactly like this UFO photographed in Europe. Lazar called it the sport model.
I gave everything simple names. There's the top hat one, and the Jello mold, and the sport model operated, without any hitches at all. I mean, it looked new. If I know what a new flying saucer looks like. One of them looked like it was hit with some sort of projectile. It had a large hole in the bottom and a large hole in the top with the metal bent out, like some sort of, large caliber 4 or 5 inch projectile had gone through it.
Even before he saw the sport model operate, Lazar says, he suspected that the ship came from somewhere else. The realization slapped him in the face the first time he glimpsed the inside of the disc.
I got to look inside, and it had really small chairs, and I think that was the first confirmation I had. That was just a shocking thing, because every time before that I was able to label it, well, this is just a little advance that a group of scientists had formed, and they're keeping it secret, and yeah, we could have built a big disc like that, that's no problem, and we could have adapted these to make it fly, but why does it have little furniture inside, essentially little seats, and things began to click together just all too fast.
A few of the discs had been completely dismantled to find out how they worked, Lazar says, but others were fully operational. A Japanese TV network created this animated version of Lazar's story after his first interview with us aired in May. Lazar says the dramatization is similar to a test flight he witnessed.
The bottom of it glowed blue and began to hiss like high voltage does on a round sphere. It's my impression that the reason that they're round and have no sharp edges is to contain the high voltage. Like if you've seen on high voltage systems, insulators, things are round or else you get a corona discharge. In either case, it began to hiss as in high voltage, and it lifted off the ground quietly, except with that little hiss in the background, and then that stopped as soon as it reached about 20, 30 feet.
Lazar says the test of the sport model was a short one, that it made only a few moves before setting back down. He didn't see who was actually flying the craft, but was very impressed nonetheless.
Well, there's no action-reaction system to it. There's no, like in a jet engine, exhaust gas being thrown out, no propeller, no noise. It's just, for all intents and purposes, magic.
To Lazar's knowledge, the flying discs are not being used for, say, any flights to Jupiter. He says excessive caution and intense secrecy contributed to the plodding pace of the program and were a main source of his disenchantment.
It's just unfair, outright, not to put it in the hands of the overall scientific community. There are people that are much more capable of dealing with this information, and by this time would have gotten a lot further along than this select group, select small group of people working out in the middle of the desert. They don't even have the facilities, really, to completely analyze what they're dealing with.
Well, he was being quiet, and if he kept me abreast of anything, he kept me abreast of the security checks. They'd randomly drop by his house. They threatened his wife. They threatened his wife's life. They had done all that, so we really didn't converse. I mean, he really was adhering to the program.
Gene Huff is a Las Vegas real estate appraiser, a regular guy who just happens to have a friend in the flying saucer business. He learned about Lazar's S4 experiences only after a long period. Lazar is anxious for people to know that he didn't just run right out and spill the secrets of the universe, and that some things are properly kept confidential.
I did not believe that this should be a security matter. Some of it, sure. But just the concept that there's definite proof, and we even have articles from another world, another system. You just can't not tell everyone. A lot of people don't believe that, but I do.
When he reached what felt like his bursting point, he took Huff and a few others to the edge of the Groom Mountains to see the flights for themselves. A total of 5 witnesses on 2 consecutive weeks managed to dodge security patrols long enough to see the strange glowing object lift above the mountains.
It came up above the same mountain. It moved around. It did a step move. It actually went up in the air like this and hovered, then dropped way down. Then it just floated around and cruised around, and then it started coming up the mountain range.
This home videotape was recorded during one of the trips to the Groom Mountains.
No, what? Did you see that move it did?
No, I didn't.
It went like it went boom, boom. Wow, look how bright it's getting.
Look at it now.
It's getting bright.
Not bright enough for me to get the son of a bitch.
Here, hold on, right here. Are you there?
No.
It is bright right now.
Admittedly, the tape proves very little by itself because with the distance and darkness, there are no reference points other than the alleged flying disc. But Lazar's information about the time and location of the test flights proved correct, not once but twice. That, according to our off-camera interviews with each of the other witnesses. Gene Huff describes his second sighting.
Through the telescope, we had seen it was an elliptically shaped light. You know, that's about, because you can only get so close, even with a telescope, to a secure facility. Anyway, it came by up by us very rapidly. It glowed and glowed brighter like a sun, and we almost got the feeling it was going to explode. It glowed so bright, and we backed up behind the car. Then it went down. It glowed back up a little bit, and very softly glided back where the mountains where it came up, hovered for a while, and then just sat down, just like you see in the movies.
Bob Lazar isn't the only person to claim inside knowledge of the flying discs at the test site. He's just the only person to say so publicly. We have communicated with several people who say they know of the saucer program. A technician in a highly sensitive position told us it is, quote, common knowledge among those with high security clearances that recovered alien discs are stored at the Nevada test site. A Las Vegas professional who once served in the military and was stationed at the test site says he saw a flying disc land outside the boundaries of Area 51, that it was quickly surrounded by security personnel, and that he was taken away and debriefed for several hours. A man who once worked at Groom Lake as a technician, at our request, wrote this letter explaining how he inadvertently walked into the wrong hangar and saw what appeared to be a large metallic disc under a tarp. It was being examined by men in lab coats. And an airman who worked at Nellis at a radar installation says he and his fellow servicemen watched over a period of 5 nights unusual objects flying over the Groom Mountains. He says the radar images indicate the object zoomed into range at speeds of 7,000 miles per hour and then would stop on a dime, and that nothing we have is capable of doing that. The airman says that when word of his sighting got out, he was ordered to turn off his radar sensors for that area and told to keep quiet about the matter because it did not happen. None of this means that the military is actually flying alien spacecraft in the Nevada desert. It could all perhaps be explained to some other secret program. Lazar insists that's not the case. We put the matter to the U.S. Navy, which, according to Lazar, is running the saucer show. 4 different naval offices were contacted. All denied having any information in their files. The Naval Research Lab said it conducted a thorough search but found zip. Naval Intelligence said much the same thing, adding it is not required to create a file where one doesn't exist. A side note, we also requested files on a UFO sighting over Tremonton, Utah in 1952. The Navy spent more than 1,000 hours studying film of that sighting, a fact that's been noted in several publications. But for purposes of our request, the Navy couldn't find those files either.
The group that runs this project, whether it really is the Navy or they just say that, apparently these people have executive power. They don't report to anyone.
Tomorrow, more troubling allegations about the military potential of alien technology. George Knapp, Eyewitness News 8.
Astronomer and UFO skeptic Carl Sagan once remarked that we cannot discount the possibility that alien evangelists are wandering the universe, looking for souls to save. Sagan does not believe that aliens have visited Earth yet, but a lot of other people do. A confirmed contact with them would certainly change the way we all look at the world, and it might even affect our religious beliefs. Tonight, in the continuation of our series on UFOs, George Knapp talks with religious leaders and also looks at the possibility that aliens have been abducting humans.
Tongues were certainly flapping when these strange Christmas lights first appeared as decorations at a Las Vegas home. The odd combination of a star and swastika raised the specter of Christmas Nazis or Noel skinheads. Paulette and George Ficou laugh at such interpretations. The symbol in the Christmas lights is the same one they wear around their necks. They say it's an interplanetary symbol of goodwill, a beacon to our space brethren to come on down.
What's the basic message here?
The basic is we was created in laboratory by the extraterrestrial.
The Ficous belong to what's called the Raelian movement, named for its prophet Rael, a former French journalist who says he was told by ETs to spread the gospel. The Raelians, now 30,000 strong worldwide, believe that space beings created humans through genetic experimentation. They firmly believe that Jesus, Moses, and Buddha were, like Rael, ET emissaries, but they don't think their faith must necessarily clash with mainstream religions.
But like Rael say, you know, if you are really good Catholic, good people, you believe, you know, in God, in Jesus, but the way you are, and you feel good in your body, that's the more important. And that's it, don't change.
Raelians aren't the first to see the parallels between religion and the UFO experience. The Bible is filled with events that, if taken literally, can just as easily be interpreted as encounters with aliens as with angels. The prophet Ezekiel reported seeing a bright fiery cloud in the sky from which 4 creatures emerged, and wheels the color of burnished brass. Zechariah says he lifted his eyes and saw a flying roll, 10 by 20 cubits. A pillar of fire led the Jews out of Egypt and hovered over the Red Sea when it parted. A bright star followed Mary and Joseph, and Jesus was lifted into a cloud and carried away, according to his disciples. The original Hebrew word for God, Elohim, can be literally translated as those who came from the sky. In the book of Genesis, God is quoted as saying, "Let us make man in our image." Similar writings from other religions are also subject to interpretation. Hindu scriptures refer to a self-propelled celestial car with many windows and a melodious sound, a blazing missile of smokeless fire. Brigham Young of the Mormon faith wrote that mankind is the offspring of parents brought here from another planet. Theologists and even anthropologists say they've found considerable evidence in ancient writings supporting the idea that ET and God are one and the same.
That what we're really dealing with is the fact that we're genetically engineered 300,000 years ago as a species. All the archaeological data that we have at this point points to it.
Between 4,000 and 8,000 BC, we had just been going along and for hundreds of thousands of years not doing anything. All of a sudden, bang, we started making pottery, invented the wheel, invented fire, and everything took off. What was the key that did that? I don't know, but it causes one to think.
This concept that humans might have been created by aliens won't be warmly embraced by the major religions. It's about as welcome as Christianity must have been to the Roman clergy. However, religious beliefs may be at the very center of the UFO experience. Some critics have suggested that UFO sightings are made for the same reasons that people believe in God. They want to believe in a higher power that can solve their problems, or because they're searching for something in their lives. The critics think that's why people call in to the UFO talk shows or take trips into the desert in hopes of seeing a UFO. This may explain part of it, but so many of the sightings are made by well-adjusted people, people of all different religious persuasions, that it can't be the complete explanation. Major religions aren't necessarily opposed to the belief that there's life elsewhere in the universe. One Catholic leader told us that a confirmation of alien life wouldn't change much at all in the Catholic faith. Others concur.
One of the most beautiful things that was ever said about this to me was said by a priest, an old friend and I think a wonderful priest, who said that nothing like this can do anything except increase the glory of God, and I think he's quite right.
Dr. Don Christensen, a Mormon stake president, says Mormons are confident there is life elsewhere.
Well, basically, we believe that God, through the Savior Jesus Christ, created this earth and peopled it, that we're sons and daughters of God, and that other similar earths have and maybe will be created.
Christensen says actual contact with alien life wouldn't change Mormon beliefs at all, but he doesn't buy the concept that UFOs and angels are the same.
No, I think the only thing I would point out is I think what people refer to as UFOs and what we talk about as angels or heavenly visitations are two separate things.
The Jewish faith also seems to have little trouble accepting the concept of life elsewhere. However, UFO true believers think despite this liberal view, religions will have to make adjustments because aliens aren't just out there.
Religion is going to have to deal with the fact that it's not just here. We're going to have to deal, as important as the Copernican revolution, the Earth isn't the center of the universe. Now, man isn't the center. You know, some people have trouble with that. The radio astronomers think they're going to discover aliens and they're going to act as the middlemen to society, giving them all the secrets of the universe. That has nothing to do with dealing today with aliens being here now.
One of the few religious doctrines that has difficulty with the alien concept is the fundamentalist Christian view. Many fundamentalists say UFOs are definitely real, but are satanic in origin. Author Whitley Strieber presents what could be an even greater challenge to contemporary religious thought. Strieber is one of thousands of people who claims to have been abducted by aliens. The alleged encounters follow the same scenario over and over again. Small gray beings with big heads and dark oval eyes pick up a subject, take them off on board a craft, perform medical exams, and then drop them off. Strieber has written 2 best-selling books about his experiences at his cabin in New York.
This experience, because it happens at the edge between dream and reality and seems so caught up in mythological symbolism and things like that, it seems to me has got something to do with the soul, and that it may be that that is the primary issue here. I don't know. We don't know much about the soul in our life, in our world, but maybe the visitors are not so blind to the soul as we are. Maybe they do understand it more.
Housewife Elka Emmons is one of those who's experienced so-called missing time. She says a UFO followed her car for miles and landed in her backyard.
And at that point, I panicked. And I shut off all the lights, and I went upstairs, and I hid in the corner of the bedroom. And as I told you, I sat there for what seemed to be no more than a minute or 2. And then I woke up in the morning.
You woke up and where were you?
I was in bed in the morning.
Yeah. You have the feeling that something happened? Or you don't like to think about it?
I obviously lost the time because I don't know how I got in bed in the morning.
Emmons fears undergoing hypnotic regression as a means of remembering what happened that night, but many other people have tried it. Their stories are remarkably similar. Psychologists say that's because the human mind will make things up to fill in the gaps. They also say UFOs are so common in the media that the alien hypothesis has been drilled into everyone's subconscious. Others think the abductions are really happening, and for disturbing reasons.
We made a deal with them, and their ultimate, what they want to do is regenerate their own race. Now, apparently, they've either had some kind of nuclear accident, or they're on the backside of a evolutionary genetic curve, and they're going downhill instead of uphill.
Lear thinks the aliens have been implanting abductees with strange little devices. As proof, he points to this odd item found by British doctors in the placental fluid of a pregnant woman. It looks to them like a microscopic computer chip. They wrote to an international science magazine asking if anyone could tell them what it was. 3 years later, they still have no explanation. This dark side of the UFO phenomenon has given rise to all sorts of conspiracy theories about why they're here and why they remain hidden. Tomorrow, in the conclusion of this series, we'll examine some of these ideas. George Knapp, Eyewitness News 8.
Some people say that the UFO cover-up may have something to do with the assassination of John Kennedy. We will look at that tomorrow. The worldwide interest in UFOs just won't go away. Despite discouragement from governments and science and religion, people all over the planet suspect that something is going on and that world governments are hiding something. Will we ever find out the full UFO story? George Knapp joins us now with the conclusion of our series, UFOs, the Best Evidence. George?
Mary Ruth and Gary, a few days ago in the comic strip Calvin and Hobbes, Calvin, the little boy in the strip, is contemplating the destruction of the environment. He says to Hobbes, the surest sign that intelligent life exists elsewhere is that none of it has tried to contact us. Calvin may be on to something. As we've learned this week, there is considerable body of information suggesting that the Earth has been visited, but we still don't have the smoking gun. We don't have absolute proof that would be needed to answer our questions one way or the other. Tonight, we look at some possible reasons why solid answers are so hard to come by, and a word of warning, some of the descriptions in this story are graphic.
This is not a question of a legitimate national security. This is a question of a few civilian and military thugs usurping the constitutional authority of the Senate and the Congress and the citizens of these United States of America to cover up an illegal transaction made with an alien nation in which American lives were traded for highly advanced technology.
If you're looking for the ultimate conspiracy, UFOs are for you. The story has it all. Aliens from outer space in secret alliance with a government cabal controlled by the Trilateral Commission, selling drugs to finance flying saucer research in a plan to take over the world and put us all in slave labor camps. UFO buff Bill Cooper, for one, says it's all true and that he read it in secret briefings while serving as a naval intelligence officer. No such conspiracy theory would be complete without tying in the John Kennedy assassination. Some UFO people point to this enhanced film of JFK's murder as proof that the gunman was actually the limo driver, a government agent. If you watch it enough times, it almost appears the driver reaches around with his left arm and points a shiny object at Kennedy just as the bullet strikes the president. But what does any of this have to do with UFOs?
President Kennedy had taken offense to the sale of drugs to the American people to finance the black projects, and that he thought the American people should know what was happening and that aliens were here and be able to decide their own fate. And for that reason, he had to be killed.
Former military officer Bill English says he read the same secret UFO reports as Cooper. He believes space aliens are here to eat us and says he saw evidence of that while serving in Vietnam when he was sent into the jungle to recover a B-52 that had disappeared after encountering a UFO. English says the plane was found intact, but the crew had been mutilated.
Sexual organs have been removed, anuses have been removed, cord to the colon. Blood had been drained from the bodies completely. As far as we were able to tell at that time, there was no blood whatsoever in the aircraft.
Most people associated with UFO research don't buy this dark side of the alien hypothesis, although they do believe there's an ongoing conspiracy of silence involving all of the world's major governments. With so much conjecture and so little hard information, it's extremely difficult to sift through the fabrications and fairy tales. But it's clear the subject has caught the attention of some of the greatest minds of this century. Winston Churchill demanded to know the meaning of flying saucers and commissioned a secret British study back in the 1950s. President Harry Truman, suspected by some of creating a panel known as Majestic 12 to study UFOs, stated if they are real, they're not from Earth. Other prominent names have dropped more tantalizing hints. Dr. Hermann Oberth, the father of modern rocketry, made his beliefs clear that flying saucers were from beyond our solar system. Dr. Werner von Braun, in explaining why an American rocket test had mysteriously gone awry, made this statement suggesting that humans were already in contact with a power from beyond. He declined to elaborate. General Douglas MacArthur was more specific, boldly predicting that the Earth would one day have to unite to defend itself against aliens. General George Marshall confided to a close friend that UFOs are real and that by hovering over our military bases, they've proven they could blow us to bits if they wanted to. Future President Gerald Ford said in the mid-1960s the American people should be enlightened on the subject of UFOs. So why hasn't this happened? If you accept the gloomy vision of Bill Cooper and Bill English and others, then the government might have good reasons for keeping the truth from the public. In fact, classified studies done for NASA and the CIA have concluded that widespread panic would be a real possibility if contact with aliens was made official. But those studies were made decades ago, and our views of ETs have certainly changed.
I think the public can handle it. I think we've been brainwashed pretty thoroughly. If you watch television in the morning, it's all spaced out stuff. You know, Gumpy was abducted and, you know, this kind of thing.
Even Friedman admits that alien visitations would cause widespread upheavals, changing the way we look at everything. Would the oil industry suddenly become worthless if we were introduced to new sources of energy or new technology? Would people think of themselves as Earthlings instead of as Americans or Russians or Chinese? A sudden, abrupt announcement would certainly have profound effects, which is why many people suspect we are being told, but in bits and pieces, conditioned over generations to accept the alien presence.
I've often wondered, what if all of us in the world discovered that we were threatened by a power from outer space, from another planet? Wouldn't we all of a sudden find that we didn't have any differences between us at all?
Ronald Reagan made allusions to alien forces not once, but 5 different times, including a speech before the United Nations.
And why did he say that 5 times? Once, it's a nice figure of speech, but he said it in the United Nations. He said it to Gorbachev in Geneva. Gorbachev responded, saying he didn't disagree with him. He said it at a high school in Maryland. Why bring that up unless there was some reason for bringing it up?
Friedman says Reagan also dropped hints in private about UFOs. One such incident occurred following a special White House screening of the movie E.T. The story was related to others by producer Steven Spielberg.
When the showing was over, Reagan got up, put his hand on Steve's shoulder and said, you know, fewer than 6 people in this room know the whole story. Now, I have a close colleague that got that direct from Steve. What I'm saying is, our society has been brainwashed.
The possibility that the government is using the mass media to influence our attitudes about UFOs is an intriguing one and not without at least circumstantial support. Consider the general tone of 1950s sci-fi movies. Grotesque, evil aliens were on Earth to conquer and destroy. It's a far cry from the gentle space creatures we know from today's films. It's interesting to note that Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind had as its scientific advisor this bit actor with the goatee, otherwise known as Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who was chief scientist in the Air Force's Project Blue Book. On television, we've got ALF and Alien Nation, different approaches to the theme of humans adjusting to an alien presence. Some UFO researchers are convinced that major corporations are participating in the indoctrination process.
Even in the print media, you see this sort of thing constantly. This is a corporate advertisement by Amoco Oil that runs in Phil Klass's favorite magazine, Aviation Week and Space Technology. And there's no direct reference in the dialogue to this high technology advertisement other than the picture itself. And I think what they're trying to tell us is that the picture speaks for itself.
Would private interests participate in the conspiracy? In 1969, several requests were put to the RAND Corporation for copies of a UFO study it had reportedly done for the government. RAND denied any knowledge of such a study, but here it is, written just a few months before the requests for copies were made, and concluding that the UFO field deserved much more study than it was getting at the time. Senator Barry Goldwater also alluded to a gradual release of UFO information. Goldwater had tried to gain access to UFO files and was turned down, but he confided in a letter he'd been told a plan was underway to release the UFO story to the public. As a presidential candidate, Jimmy Carter vowed to completely open the government's UFO files because Carter said he had seen one himself. In 1977, there were hints in national magazines that disturbing revelations were about to be made by the president. They never were, and Carter didn't open the files. We wrote to ask him why, and were told Carter is too busy for any interviews. Perhaps the secrecy isn't the government's idea. Perhaps it originates elsewhere.
It's quite obvious that the secrecy doesn't even originate with the government. Why don't the visitors land on the White House lawn and make themselves public. Why didn't they do that this morning? The reason is they themselves are the architects of the secrecy.
Strieber, who claims to have been abducted by aliens several times, says that humans should not presume to understand the motives of the visitors. Perhaps they are adhering to Star Trek's prime directive, non-interference with developing species. If the aliens have been observing Earth for any length of time, they've witnessed untold examples of war, barbarism, and environmental destruction. UFOs have been chased and shot at, and would probably be suspicious of any culture that produces dissect and alien games for its children. Maybe they're not ready for us. Are we ready for them?
So people are used to the idea that there's probably other life out there. And for it to contact us, I don't think would be major disruption.
So you fear the unknown. If you know all about UFOs, the fact they're here, there's going to be no panic. That's the excuse they've used since the Orson Welles Mercury radio program in 1938. The people did panic. We are far more sophisticated than that.
I really would like to know. I really would. And I really would like everybody to know. I think it's extremely important that everybody have the truth.
I think people need to realize that, yes, there has been an alien visitation. They're here, and I don't think that will upset people. It might upset them that the government has hidden it, but I don't think they'll fear that aliens have actually been here as much as they fear what possible tidings the aliens may bring.
It's true. What I have seen is true. I don't know about the big story, where they came from, what they're like, but certainly these crafts came from another, not just another planet, another solar system entirely, extremely far away, and they're here.
What we've learned this week is that the government has lied to us about UFOs, has withheld information, has spied on UFO organizations, and has discredited UFO witnesses. Now, none of this proves that UFOs are real, but it does indicate a disturbing level of interest, government interest, in the subject. If the government won't tell us what it knows, what about science? Well, science is supposed to stand for the investigation of the unexplained, not the explanation of the uninvestigated. And so far, science has avoided the subject like a plague. It's like what Roy Neary, the main character in the film Close Encounters, had to say: all we want to know is what's going on.
Maybe this answers my own question, all that black in that one document you showed. What about the Freedom of Information Act?
Well, it has been useful. We used it. It's been useful in the past for getting some information out of the government, but it's almost like the only stuff that comes out is what the government wants to release. We filed FOI requests with the Navy, the Air Force, FBI, CIA, and NASA, and got really very little information. And some of the information we requested and were told didn't exist had already been released to other people who had asked for it. So obviously, they're not releasing everything. There are some people who have been fighting the National Security Agency and the CIA to force them to release the documents that we saw in that piece that were blacked out, and the government has withheld it on the grounds of national security.
Well, George, a lot of time people call for a congressional hearing. Would that do the trick?
Well, I think Congress has held hearings on the subject twice before, once in 1966 and once in 1968. In 66, only the Air Force was allowed to testify. In 68, the witnesses were allowed to talk about UFOs, but they couldn't blast the Air Force to talk about Project Blue Book. Now, if they were going to have another congressional hearing, they'd have to make sure, for purposes of public satisfaction, that it was completely unrelated to government people. People without ties to the CIA, people like that could not be involved with the investigation. We should also point out, though, if you want to get the real story on this, there are people probably watching this program right now who know a lot about this subject, living right here in Nevada, and our number is in the phone book. We should point out some of these people have already called us, and that this investigation will continue, and that we're planning a 2-hour special, including all the stories we've done so far, later on in this month.
Okay, it has been fascinating.